Hey guys, Miss Cote here, and here's another video for the energy unit. In a previous video, we looked at how energy can be transferred to different forms and what this could look like in the metabolism of the cell. In this episode, we're going to start looking at the process of cellular respiration, how cells can extract the energy stored in organic molecules and use it to make ATP so the cell can do work. So let's get started. In order to do what they need to do, cells need to get energy from outside sources. Some organisms, like the trees, are autotrophs. They have the ability to do photosynthesis and make their own food, and then break that food down for energy. My buddy the giraffe here is a heterotroph, and since it does not have the ability to make its own food, he has to get its energy by eating the plants. And unfortunately for the giraffe, some animals don't eat plants and need to get their energy by eating other animals. Remember that energy flows into an ecosystem as sunlight and leaves as heat. In between, it gets transferred from the environment to an organism through photosynthesis, and then from organism to organism through a food chain. At each organism or trophic level, some of that energy is used to do cellular work. And at every level, energy is leaving the ecosystem as heat. And while energy flows in a one-way direction, the matter, the atoms that make up the molecules, are recycled. The molecules that are products of photosynthesis become the reactants for cellular respiration, and vice versa. Earlier, we learned that there are two types of pathways, catabolic and anabolic. Cellular respiration deals with catabolic pathways, where we are breaking a larger molecule down to smaller pieces and therefore releasing energy. Some of the energy is used to do cellular work. The rest is given off as heat. Remember, another way to describe this reaction is exergonic. There are two types of catabolic processes involved in cellular respiration, and it depends on whether oxygen is involved or not. If no oxygen is present, this is called anaerobic respiration or fermentation. During this chapter, but in another video, we'll discuss why fermentation is important and look at a couple of fermentation pathways. If oxygen is present, then this is referred to as aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is the more efficient pathway and will produce a lot of ATP that the cell can use to do work. So while the term cellular respiration includes both anaerobic and aerobic processes, we usually use it to refer to the aerobic process. And while we usually just talk about breaking down glucose during cellular respiration, please note that we can break down fats and proteins as well and feed the monomers into the cellular respiration pathway at various points. This figure is from the last section of the chapter, which is not in the scope of the course. However, I've seen this figure used on College Board questions, so I'm using it here to show you where amino acids, glycerol, and fatty acids can be incorporated into the pathways. Not that you need to memorize this, but just be able to interpret the diagram to answer a question. So to go back to the last slide, the one thing you do have to memorize is the equation for cellular respiration, which begins with the molecule glucose. So how do we transfer the energy from glucose to ATP? That question can be answered by the transfer of electrons. The chemical reactions involved in cellular respiration involve moving electrons and therefore stored energy from one molecule to another. These reactions are coupled. One substance will lose electrons and is said to be oxidized, while another substance gains electrons, which is said to be reduced. Together, oxidation-reduction reactions can also be called redox reactions. You may not even realize it, but you've already studied a basic redox reaction. For your summer assignment, you looked at how an ionic bond forms, and the book used sodium chloride as an example. Sodium has one valence electron, and it readily gives up and donates that electron to chlorine, which has 7 valence electrons. So now each has a full outer shell. When sodium loses its electron, the sodium ion now has a positive charge. It has been oxidized. The chloride ion has gained an electron and now has a negative charge. it has been reduced. Unfortunately, redox reactions in biology may not be as easy and as straightforward as this example, but there are ways to figure out which molecule is being oxidized and which molecule is being reduced. Let's look at our equation of cellular respiration as an example. During cellular respiration, glucose is being oxidized and oxygen is being reduced. It may not be as easy to figure that out in this chemical formula because there are no positive or negative charges on any of the molecules. My advice to you is follow the hydrogens. A hydrogen atom can be split up into an electron and a proton, the H+. So wherever the hydrogen goes, the electron is also going. In this example, glucose is the carbon-based molecule that has 12 hydrogens on the left side of the arrow. On the right side, the only carbon-based molecule is carbon dioxide. So glucose has lost its hydrogens and therefore the electrons. Losing electrons is being oxidized. The oxygen molecule on the left side of the arrow now gains hydrogens and therefore the electrons. On the right side of the arrow, gaining electrons is being reduced. Hopefully, this way of thinking about redox reactions in biology helps you out. So why are there so many steps involved in cellular respiration? If we were able to extract the energy all at once, it would be pretty much an explosive reaction and not be much good to the cell. What the cell does is to take the energy out a little at a time and transfer it as hydrogen atoms to carrier molecules, which will eventually transfer the hydrogen atoms to oxygen. The main carrier molecule in cellular respiration is a coenzyme called NAD+. Don't worry about the full name or its structure. You don't need to know that information. What you do need to know is that NAD+ is capable of accepting electrons and being reduced to NADH. See, when it accepts electrons, it also accepts the hydrogen with it. So the energy extracted from glucose is now temporarily being stored in NADH. NADH will bring this energy to something called the electron transport chain, where it will be ultimately transferred to ATP. For the rest of the videos in this chapter, we'll be looking at the steps of cellular respiration in more detail. The entire process can be broken up into 3 major stages. The first stage is called glycolysis, which literally means splitting glucose. This is where we start off with a molecule of glucose, which has 6 carbons, and break it up into 2 molecules of pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon molecule. This is a multi-step pathway that produces some molecules of NADH and some ATP. Also notice that glycolysis takes place in the cytosol of the cell, not in the mitochondria. The second stage is the citric acid cycle, which is also called the Krebs cycle. There is also a quick series of reactions called pyruvate oxidation just before it. This is where the pyruvates are fully broken down in another multi-step pathway to produce some molecules of NADH and FADH2, which is another coenzyme, and some ATP. Notice that these reactions take place in the mitochondrion, more specifically in the matrix, which is inside the inner membrane. The last stage is called oxidative phosphorylation, which is actually in 2 parts, the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. This is where the majority of ATP is made from the high energy electrons that were temporarily stored in NADH and FADH2. These reactions take place in the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. Oxidative phosphorylation is responsible for about 90% of the ATP made from cellular respiration, and this is done in a series of redox reactions. Notice that the ATP produced in the other 2 stages are made from another type of phosphorylation called substrate-level phosphorylation. Instead of redox reactions, substrate-level phosphorylation creates ATP by a direct transfer of a phosphate group from another molecule with the help of an enzyme. So there's your overview of cellular respiration. Please get yourself familiar with this diagram. You could probably see either this or something like this for questions about cellular respiration. For those of you who like the sketch notes, this would be a great diagram to start with, and then you can add whatever you need as we go through the stages in more detail. And I think this is a good place to end this video. So bring any questions to ask during class, and as always, be a good human.